On July the 1st, 2011, a new version of BREEAM was introduced called BREEAM New Construction. If you're watching this programme in the UK, then you'll now have to comply with the 2011 edition rather than the 2008 version. For those working abroad, a separate BREEAM International Bespoke method should be used in countries where there is no alternative or appropriate national system of assessment. And BREEAM Gulf has been withdrawn. So, whether you say BREEAM or BREEAM, we're delighted to have our very own technical Supremo to explain the key issues in the new UK version. I'm so sorry about that, Jeff. That's the worst introduction you've ever had, isn't it, on all the programmes that you've done for us?
Definitely, definitely.
So let me introduce Jeff Wilkinson. He is the Building Regulations columnist with the Architects Journal, a very experienced approved inspector and a very welcome returning guest to these programmes. So, Jeff, first things first, what is BREEAM and what's it used for?
Okay, it's the Building Research Establishment's environmental assessment method. It's basically a benchmarking system for assessing the comparative performance of buildings. If you imagine white goods, fridges, freezers, that kind of thing are sort of modelled A to F, it's pretty much that kind of arrangement that you've got, and you can award credits for various things that the building actually has in the way in which it performs.
So the BREEAM version for houses was called Eco Homes, wasn't it? That then became the code for sustainable homes. Yeah. Does the new BREEAM 2011 affect domestic assessments?
No, it doesn't apply to residential buildings at all. It's, if you like, the code for sustainable buildings other than dwellings.
So we have two codes, one for sustainable homes and one for other buildings?
Absolutely. It applies to pretty much any form of commercial or public development, so offices, warehousing, public buildings such as libraries, schools. Currently excludes data centres and excludes residential buildings. That said, a mixed development building, including residential, could potentially be done under it.
What about hospitals, healthcare?
Hospitals, healthcare, they could be dealt with under this as well. It would exclude fit-outs, for example, or refurbishment projects, which are still carried out under the 2008 version.
And for the first time, they're charging.
They are indeed. There's a huge £120 fee that you need to cough up right at the assessment stage when you're actually registering the project. Importantly, providing you complete the assessment within a period of 3 years, you'll actually get the £120 back. If you don't complete within the 3 years, then it's non-refundable.
OK, so BREEAM has shown itself to be the environmental assessment method of choice for many designers in the UK. Let's just have a quick look at the differences and similarities between the other major international player, the American assessment system, LEED.
LEED, which stands for the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, was set up by the United States Green Building Council, whereas BREEAM was set up by the BRE. Both represent major commercial interests in the establishment of a global environmental brand, and the UK Green Building Council seems to be supportive of BREEAM 2011. The BRE is a research organisation funded by government. LEED is a membership organisation. Its 10,000 member organisations publicly review data in a transparent process to develop its technical criteria. BRE has been described as having a more scientific basis to its calculation processes, but also a more tick-box approach. LEED criteria include sustainable sites. This rewards minimising a building's impact on ecosystems and waterways and bans building on farmland or wetlands. There's no real equivalent in BREEAM 2011. Ecosystems is only mentioned once, for example, although it does reward building on land with a low ecological value. BRE Global has been liaising with members of the Ecology Task Group and has agreed improvements to the existing criteria. Water efficiency. This requires more efficient appliances and what LEED calls water-conscious landscaping. BREEAM is somewhat more prescriptive than LEED's discretionary criteria. Energy and atmosphere. This deals with energy-efficient commissioning, monitoring, design and construction. LEED tends to focus on the cost of energy saved, BREEAM on the carbon savings. Materials and resources. LEED promotes sustainable manufacture and transport, as well as waste reduction, reuse and recycling. BREEAM awards more points for this item. Indoor environmental quality covers the improvement in indoor air quality, natural daylight and insulation in the LEED criteria. This item tends to be picked up in approved documents rather than in BREEAM 2011. Furthermore, like LEED, BREEAM's objectives are to raise awareness and education, providing homeowners, tenants and building managers with user information packs. Similarly, both BREEAM 2011 and LEED award extra points for the use of innovative technologies that improve a building's performance beyond what is required by usual means. LEED provides the following certification: a basic certificate for a score of 40 to 49 points. Silver is a score of 50 to 59, gold is up to 79 points, platinum is 80 points and above. These points roughly equate to percentages. BREEAM 2011 certifies buildings as either a pass, which represents a score of 30 to 44%, good is up to 54%, very good is up to 69%, excellent 70 to 84%, and outstanding, which is 85% and above.
So LEED and BREEAM are much of a muchness. One of the main differences between the two, it seems, is that LEED is slightly less prescriptive. But Jeff, BREEAM 2011 does seem to be even more benchmark-led, if I can put it like that, than 2008. Do you think that's a good thing overall?
Ultimately, it is a benchmarking systems, therefore you've got to have a series of benchmarks in it. The more benchmarks there are, the easier it is to genuinely compare the performance of one building against the other. I suppose the question really is, have we got the right benchmarks, and do we need flexibility within those benchmarks or not? That's one that's going to pan out, I think, over a period of time.
OK, and it requires an assessment at both the design and the construction phases, doesn't it? What do you think the purpose is of that?
Well, some of the background to that is that the actual performance of buildings compared with what they were anticipating them to come out at was showing dramatic differences. There was a study into the Gherkin, for example, which showed that the performance of the Gherkin was actually 25 to 30% worse than had originally been modelled. So the purpose of the design phase is to ensure that you've got the criterion right in the first instance, and then you've got to model it again to ensure that when you actually come to the handover phase, the building's actually operating correctly, so that you cut out this big differential between design and actual.
Well, let's have a look now at how the system actually works and start with the design stage assessment. So when in the design stage are we talking about, and what roughly does it involve?
Yeah. Well, as any assessor will tell you, the earliest possible stage is the time to get them on board. If you think about it in sort of the A to C stage of the architect's plan, you'll be looking at things like the location of the site, transport infrastructure, those kind of things. Now, there are credits for each and every one of those criteria. Something in the region of 20 to 30% of credits are actually available in that early sort of feasibility stage. So if you actually miss the boat on that, it's going to become very difficult to regain those kind of credits. As you then progress on into sort of stage D, design stage, there's probably the bulk of credits available then. Somewhere in the region of about 40 to 50% of credits are available then. So you really want to get it as early as possible within the design phases. The earlier the appointment, the better it is. There are 3 credits available potentially for having the assessor on board and in attendance at each of the design team meetings.
And what about the completion assessment, or I suppose should that be post-completion?
It's not actually post-completion. Contrary to what a lot of people think, it's actually more like pre-handover. The idea of the assessment is actually to ensure that the building is commissioned, set up and ready for handover and for the users of the building. Although I would point out that to achieve the top outstanding rating, there is actually a requirement for post-completion reporting for a period of up to 3 years, with that information going back to BRE. And BRE are very keen on actually obtaining that information and recording onto a national database so that we can start making more informed decisions in the future, particularly how we develop the code itself.
Indeed. Well, so far, I suppose, so similar. Let's look at some of the key differences between this 2011 version and the 2008 version. The aggregate approach from approved document L is one of the biggest single changes. Well, without asking you to go too far into part L in this particular programme, could you just give us a quick recap, Jeff?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the principal reasons for the change in the first instance is to bring the BREEAM code up into the same realm as the changes that have happened to Part L. We had a bizarre scenario where you could actually obtain an excellent or outstanding rating and potentially actually not comply with current building regulation because you had the time gap, you see, between Part L coming out in October 2010, okay, and the BREEAM code coming out July 2011. So for that period of time we had this anomaly between the two codes of practice. Dealing with the aggregate approach, what actually happened was that there is a 25% improvement over the requirements of the 2006 building regulations, but that isn't an even 25%. Okay, there's differences between different building types. A warehouse, for example, may actually need to achieve something like a 35% improvement, whereas an office or a retail unit may only actually come out at a 20% improvement. So there's quite a range of flexibility within that, and that has had to be reflected in the revisions to BREEAM. Now, what they've done is they've taken the national calculation methodology from Part L, okay, so the SBEM calculation, and they've moved that forward into the new BREEAM code.
Okay, well, BREEAM's benchmarks should, according to this, encourage the zero carbon hierarchy and reward carbon negative buildings. Can you tell me more about this hierarchy?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, to quote a well-known insurance ad, it's simples. If you imagine a pyramid, okay, at the bottom of the pyramid is the biggest area that you can actually affect, okay, and that relates to the energy performance of the building. So it's actually the thermal insulation values that the building can actually achieve. Then the next layer up, okay, is the in-use elements. So it's the services, the electrical requirements, the lighting, those kind of things. And then the final peak, if you like, are the zero carbon technologies. So you actually work your way up through from the base of the pyramid to the top of the pyramid, working your way through, and that's how the hierarchy works.
Right, okay, well, thanks for that. Now, famously, the government omitted the use of appliances to feature in its definition of zero carbon homes, didn't it? Has that been picked up yet, do you know?
It's actually a slightly different definition, as is always the case with these things, between zero carbon in this and zero carbon in the definition the government are using for homes.
For appliances,
Okay. What I would say though is that the issue has been picked up. There is an additional credit available now for zero carbon technology, and there's a credit available for life cycle costing. So there are two bits that are actually built in specifically to deal with LZCs.
Yeah, and what about SEN M350 and the standardisation mandate? What part has that played?
That's an excellent question. I'm really glad you've asked me that. The SEN requirements...
Usually that means it has a very complicated answer.
It has an incredibly complicated answer that I'll try and simplify to the easiest amount possible. The SEN requirements have come from the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. Okay, the intention of that is to harmonise environmental standards across the whole of Europe. Okay, it's actually a voluntary code, so how much effect it will actually have is perhaps a longer term requirement, if you like. What we are seeing though is that the materials manufacturers, the product manufacturers, are adopting that in the way that they're testing the individual elements that go into the buildings. In the longer term, the hope is to have a harmonised code across the whole of Europe and a standardised way in which we can actually look at it. You mentioned earlier, for example, the LEED standard, okay, and the gradual convergence between some of these international standards. SEN hopefully will lead to that coming about in the longer term.
And presumably that has to be a good thing for the industry.
It's got to be a lot better if we've got one consistent way of doing it, rather than picking or choosing between which badge, if you like, fits best the way in which you're intending to work your building.
Well, can we go through some of the changes in a little bit more detail?
Sure.
I mean, first of all, BREEAM has tightened up, hasn't it, on minimum standards for water and for waste.
Yep.
Can you talk us through those?
Again, BRE are developing up in effect, a version of the water use calculator for commercial buildings. That's something which is part of a longer term plan. But there are credits already introduced for things like water leak detection and also for water process controls. So where water is used in the processes that are actually used within the building, there's now a credit for that where previously there wasn't. In terms of waste, we're actually looking far more at the on-site construction waste as well as another example, and the journey of any material from where it starts at the factory gate to the site, okay, how it's used on site, and then if there's a need to recycle or take it back to the original manufacturer, what that journey is as well. So all of that feeds into the credit now.
Good, and it now tackles as well sustainable procurement, doesn't it? What do you think specifiers need to be aware of here?
Well, again, I think one of the core points here is to take on board the early appointment of the assessor. Okay, by doing that, they can actually advise all the way through the process as to sustainable procurement. I'll give you another example. There's potentially a credit available for the use of a considerate contractor scheme. So the actual choice of contractor can affect the way in which you're doing it, so that feeds all the way through. There's also something known as the soft landing, okay, which is where the procurement methods and the deliverables are actually discussed with the building users. Okay, so you're actually having an on-board team of the people who actually use the building when it's complete, get them to understand why you've designed it, how you've designed it, how the contractor feeds into that. The O&M manuals, all of those things all feed into this sustainable procurement. So literally it is the whole life cycle all the way through to the building users.
And generally speaking, I mean, I get the sense from you that these are all positive moves. Yeah,
I think everything here is a positive move. There's no negative to my mindset in any of this. The more we actually educate people on how to use a building, the better the building's going to perform in the longer term. That's got to be a good thing. But by the same token, we've also got to avoid taking on board the scientific aspect and designing buildings from a scientific point of view or the environmental energy point of view, rather than what the building users actually want. So if we can get that feedback put into it, then we can have buildings that people actually enjoy using and living in.
Well, there's another one I'd like to ask you about. There's a new reporting requirement for volatile organic compounds, for example, and for a raft of other key performance indicators. So how do they differ from the 2008 version?
In essence, to say that there are literally hundreds of credit changes that occur within the document itself. Some of them are quite fine. The ones that you mentioned there actually relate to the indoor air quality credit. Again, this has been looked at in terms of the changes that occurred to approved document F of the building regulations, and what's happened there is that there's now a requirement, or there's a credit available in effect at the end of the project, where you actually look at measuring the formaldehyde levels that remain in the building before the occupants come in. Basically, it's noxious smells, that kind of thing, remaining within the building, so the building smells and is clean, tidy when it's actually handed over.
But there are some anomalies though, aren't there, Jeff? And some odd ones. I mean, it's been reported that under the responsible sourcing of materials, for example, you've got large concrete suppliers can actually achieve more points than certified timber or reused material suppliers. And you think, well, hang on, that's a bit odd.
Yeah, and there's a whole series of anomalies within BREEAM itself. And I think more of these will actually come out as we start to see the first calculations, the first modelling under the new standard. Dealing specifically with that, you actually have in effect 8 tiers, okay, of assessment for these particular materials. Funnily enough, BRE's own system is the one that comes out at the top of the 8 criteria, and within that, concrete manufacturers, as you quite rightly say, can actually end up bizarrely with more credits than reused aggregate materials or even sustainable timber products, which really does seem bizarre, and is one of the things I think needs to be looked at when we move the system forward.
Now, life cycle costing, I seem to remember doing several programmes on that over the years, but that seems to have been downplayed in BREEAM 2011. Why do you think that is? Predominantly
because no one can make it work. It is predominantly as simple as that. There is a lot of effort put into that particular part of the system, and it hasn't actually shown to be a worthwhile investment in time, money and effort, if you like. So they've downwashed the whole of that particular credit.
So they are actually changing things according to experience,
Which I guess that's exactly what needs to be done. But you also need to watch the fact that a building that's assessed under the system today, okay, could well be different to the one in 3-4 months' time. And I think that evolution needs to be controlled, because say it will evolve and it will sort of cancel out some of these anomalies, but it's got to be done on a step-by-step basis.
Well, a recent Salford research project has shown that buildings built in 1976 have a 25% better energy performance than the upcoming 2013 standards. One of the main reasons, it seems, is that they simply had 200 millimetres insulation throughout. So such a simple thing, Jeff. I mean, you can't help wondering, have we complicated things too much?
It's certainly a good point. The first thing I've got to say is the vast majority of buildings built in 1976 didn't have 200 millimetres of insulation. So it's been a gradual upgrade of insulation requirements. Personally, I think there's a strong move towards the passive house standard. It's something that I'd support very strongly, but that very much is a subject for another programme perhaps. But certainly the super insulated, airtight form of construction, which is relatively simple, 4 key areas to it, has got to be a brilliant way forward.
Oh, well, thank you so much for your insights today, Jeff. Thank you. I do hope you found that useful. Many thanks indeed, obviously, to Jeff Wilkinson for coming in and explaining quite a complicated issue so brilliantly. Thanks to you for watching. Until next time, goodbye. That's terrific. Thank you very much indeed. I mean, so it sounds like, okay, it's a bit more red tape for people, but it's going to be worthwhile.